Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're zeroing in on something in almost every kitchen: spices. Those flavor powerhouses.
Absolutely.
We're digging into a recent study from Lancaster, Pennsylvania. It looked closely at whether certain heavy metals, arsenic, cadmium, lead, might be, lurking in common spices.
Yeah, it's important stuff.
So our mission here is pretty straightforward. Understand what this research actually found, why it matters for you, and, well, what the potential takeaways are.
And it definitely deserves our attention.
Yeah.
Heavy metal exposure, even low levels over time, it's a known public health concern.
Right.
Especially for young kids,
Yeah.
Their developing brains are just more susceptible. And spices, we might only use a little bit, but lots of us use them daily.
So it adds up.
It potentially adds up, yeah. They're a possible pathway for these contaminants globally.
And the Lancaster focus is interesting. Why specifically there?
Well, Lancaster has this really diverse population. It also has a high rate of refugee resettlement.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, refugee populations sometimes face higher risks, like lead poisoning. Add to that, Lancaster County actually has more young kids with elevated blood lead levels than the rest of Pennsylvania.
So finding potential sources there is really crucial.
Exactly. Pinpointing exposure sources is key. And the researchers, they took a very practical approach.
How so?
They got their hands on 116 different spice samples. Some they just bought off the shelves in stores around Lancaster.
So what's commercially available?
Right, a snapshot of that. And others were donated by families living right there in Lancaster.
Ah, so you get a sense of what people are actually using at home.
Exactly. A direct look into the kitchen cupboard, so to speak.
Okay, so the big question then, what did they actually find? Were these metals present?
Yes. And the findings were pretty eye-opening. Arsenic, cadmium, and lead. They detected them in over 90% of the samples tested.
90%? Wow, that seems high.
It is high. It means these metals are, well, quite prevalent in the spices they looked at. Now, if we talk median concentrations, sort of the middle value, they found arsenic at 0.048 parts per million, cadmium at 0.056 ppm, and lead at 0.177 ppm.
ppm, parts per million. That sounds tiny, like you said, grains of sand on a bead.
It is a tiny unit, absolutely. Yeah. But it's still important to know it's there, especially with consistent exposure.
Right. So they're present, but are these levels actually worrying? How do they stack up against, safety standards?
Good question. And this is where the study gets really interesting. They compared their findings to safety limits from the New York State Department of Health NYSDOH from 2023.
Okay, pretty recent standards.
Yes. And also to guidelines from the World Health Organization, the WHO, though those are older, from 2007.
So comparing against benchmarks, what did that show?
Well, against those New York State standards, a significant chunk of samples exceeded the limits.
How significant?
For arsenic, it was just over 6%, cadmium, around 3.5%, but lead was one that really jumped out.
Yeah.
Over 40% of the samples had lead levels higher than the NYSDOH limit.
40% for lead. That sounds like a lot. Okay, what about the WHO guidelines? Did those show the same thing?
No, actually, a very different picture with the WHO limits. Exceedances were much lower.
How much lower?
0% for arsenic, just under 2% for cadmium, and for lead, a tiny fraction, less than 0.1%.
Whoa, that's a huge discrepancy. Why such a big difference between New York's limits and the WHO's?
That's a really critical point. The WHO standards they referenced, they're primarily designed for herbal remedies, not specifically for culinary spices used in food.
Oh, okay. So like medicinal herbs may be taken in larger amounts sometimes.
Exactly, or maybe concentrated supplements. It's a different use case than sprinkling a bit of paprika or cumin in your dinner.
Got it.
And that difference really highlights a potential regulatory gap,
Right.
We lack universally agreed upon standards specifically for heavy metals in spices as food ingredients.
That makes sense. So maybe the New York limits are a more relevant comparison here since they're focused on food safety within the state.
Possibly, yes. It's a more direct comparison for food use.
Now, the study also looked into differences between the store-bought spices and the ones donated from homes, right? What came out of that?
Yeah, and this was quite interesting, too. For arsenic and lead, the median levels were actually higher in the store-purchased spices.
Higher in store-bought, really?
Yes. And for arsenic, that difference wasn't just random chance. It was statistically significant. Plus, a higher percentage of those store-bought spices went over the New York limits for both arsenic and lead.
That's counterintuitive, isn't it? You'd almost assume commercial products might have tighter controls.
You might think that. But cadmium flipped the script. A higher percentage of the home-donated spices exceeded the NYSDOH limit for cadmium.
Okay, so it's not a simple picture. Different metals, different patterns.
Exactly. It suggests maybe different contamination sources or pathways for different metals. Could be supply chain stuff, could be environmental factors, maybe even packaging or storage at home for the donated ones.
Fascinating. Did they look at where the store-bought spices came from, like country of origin?
They did, where the labels had that info. Over half were either manufactured or processed. In India, about 28%, or right here in the USA, just over 23%.
And the rest?
A real mix. Pakistan, Nepal, Kenya, Vietnam, Taiwan, Bhutan, Guatemala, Australia, Japan, Thailand, Peru. A lot of places.
Did where they came from seem to matter for the metal levels?
Well, it's interesting. Spices listed as from the USA actually showed higher median concentrations of arsenic and cadmium compared to those from other countries combined.
Higher from the U.S.?
Yeah, but the researchers noted these differences weren't statistically significant in this study. So maybe something to watch, but not conclusive here.
Okay.
And for lead, the percentage exceeding the New York limit was pretty similar between U.S.-sourced and other source spices.
So origin gives some clues, but maybe not the whole story. Raises questions about farming practices or soil everywhere, I guess.
It does. It's complex.
Were there any specific types of spices that stood out? Like, did turmeric have more issues than cumin, for example?
They did find some standouts. Actually, the single highest levels for all three metals, arsenic, cadmium, and lead, were all found in spices bought from the very same store.
The same store?
Yes, one whose name suggested it was an international market. Highest arsenic was in turmeric from Thailand. Highest cadmium and paprika from the USA.
And the lead, you mentioned that was the big one earlier.
Right. The highest lead concentration, really concerningly high at 31.9 ppm, was found in a curry powder, also listed as from the USA from that same store.
31.9 ppm. Wow. That specific curry powder sounds like a real outlier.
It certainly was. And that led the researchers to the next logical step, trying to figure out what these levels actually mean for exposure, especially for young children.
Right, because they're the most vulnerable group. How did they estimate that?
They used data on typical spice consumption amounts for young kids, ages 1 to 5. Then they calculated the estimated daily intake, the EDI, based on the metal concentrations they measured.
Okay, makes sense.
And then they compared those estimated intakes to reference doses from the EPA and the FDA, basically, levels considered generally safe for daily consumption.
And what did that exposure assessment show overall? Generally okay, or?
Mostly using the median concentrations. The estimated daily intakes for all three metals were generally low, below those safety thresholds.
Okay, that's somewhat reassuring for average consumption.
Yes, for the average. However, that one curry powder sample, the one with the super high lead, the estimated daily intake of lead from just that one product would actually exceed the FDA's reference level for lead for a young child.
Just from the amount typically used. Wow.
Exactly. And there were two other samples, paprika and one of the home-donated spices, where the estimated lead intake got pretty close to that FDA level.
So while the average might seem low, these specific products could definitely pose a risk.
Precisely. It really highlights that individual products can be a concern, even if the overall average looks okay, especially for kids.
It really drives home the potential impact, doesn't it? These outliers matter.
They absolutely do. And the researchers rightly point out, this isn't just a Lancaster issue. Their findings line up with other studies globally that have found heavy metals in spices.
So it's a wider pattern. Where does the contamination come from?
It can happen at multiple points. Could be the soil the plants grow in. Could be post-harvest handling, drying, processing.
Okay.
And disturbingly, sometimes it can even be intentional adulteration. Things like adding lead chromate to make turmeric or curry powders look bright or yellow.
Actually adding lead compounds for color, that's awful.
It is really troubling. And this study, it really puts a spotlight on the regulatory situation, or maybe the lack of one.
How so?
In the U.S., apart from New York State setting its own limits, there aren't specific federal regulations for heavy metals in spices.
No federal standard just for spices.
Not specifically targeting them like New York did. And internationally, as we discussed, existing standards often cover different things, like those herbal remedies, not necessarily everyday cooking spices.
So there's a real gap in consistent, specific rules.
A significant gap. It makes ensuring safety across the board a real challenge.
Seems like this study is a strong call for more attention here.
Definitely. The researchers explicitly call for ongoing monitoring of heavy metals and spices, and for developing standardized guidelines to improve food safety.
Right.
They even mentioned the recent applesauce recall, which was linked to lead-contaminated cinnamon, as a kind of cautionary tale, a reminder of why this vigilance is so important.
That applesauce incident was scary. It really brought contamination issues to the forefront.
It did. And for Pennsylvania, where this study took place, remember those higher rates of elevated blood lead in kids?
Yes.
This research provides some really important initial data. It suggests spices could be a contributing factor there, something that needs more investigation in their environmental risk assessments. It's another potential piece of that lead exposure puzzle.
Adds another layer, yeah. Points to where more research and maybe public health efforts need to look. Okay, so let's try to wrap up this deep dive into the Lancaster spice study. What are the absolute key takeaways for people listening?
I think the main things are, 1, heavy metals, particularly lead, are definitely present in many common spices.
Okay.
2, in quite a few cases, especially for lead compared to the New York limits, those levels can exceed current safety guidelines.
Got it.
3, while the average daily intake might seem low, certain individual spice products can carry a much higher risk. This is especially true for vulnerable groups like young children.
The outlier issue.
Exactly. And finally, the lack of consistent, specific regulations for heavy metals and spices is a critical point. It's something that really needs addressing to better protect public health.
It really leaves you with a thought, doesn't it? We use spices all the time, almost automatically in our cooking.
Daily, for many of us.
And even if it's a small amount per meal, that potential for long-term low-level exposure to these metals, well, it's there. It makes you wonder how much scrutiny is really being applied to the safety of these ingredients, these things that make our food taste good. What steps can be taken by consumers, by regulators, to get more transparency and maybe stronger rules for the spice supply chain? This Lancaster study, it's offered a fascinating, maybe slightly uncomfortable glimpse into something we might overlook, and it raises some big questions about the standards we rely on.